Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second session of the conference, held by Indic Researchers Forum, where we seek to present matters and address issues of international interests and issues of national interest through an Indic perspective. This session will be on security and geopolitical assessment of war. The session chair for this session will be Professor Swaran Singh Sir. Dr. Swaran Singh is currently a visiting professor at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada, and a professor of diplomacy, disarmament at Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, CIPOD, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He is a president of Association of Asia Scholars, General Secretary of Indian Association of Asian and Pacific Studies, guest professor at Research Institute of Indian Ocean Economics, Yunnan University of Finance and Economics, China, and he is part of the advisory board of Atlanta-based Communities Without Border Incorporation, United States. Professor Swaran Singh has more than 25 years of experience in research and teaching, and he lectures at major institutions like National Defense College, Defense Services Staff College, and all other major military institutions. Along with that, he also has given lectures at Foreign Services Institute, Indian Institute for Public Administration, etc. He has also contributed to various radio and television discussions as well. Further on in this session, we will be having the following speakers: Professor M.D. Nalapat Sir, Executive Director at ITV Network; Dr. Satori Nagao, Fellow Non-Resident at Hudson Institute; Professor Datesh Parulekar, Assistant Professor at University of Goa; Dr. Alexander Dudchek, Economist and Political Scientist from Russia; Hans Jakob Schindler, he's a senior director at Counterterrorism Project. Thank you, everyone, and over to you, Swaran Singh, sir.
Good morning, afternoon, good evening to all of you, depending on where you're joining from. I'm delighted to become part of this discussion today. And we have a panel of eminent speakers, and I'm sure discussion is going to be very lively. Ukraine war, which has gone on now for more than a year, has transformed several of the premises that we have held, especially in international relations, especially about the understanding of institution of war. And in that sense, it is going to be an enormous inflection point for several disciplines. And I'm sure the speakers of this panel will make very significant contributions to the ongoing debate. I wouldn't stand between the participants and the panelists now. In case there is a little bit of time at the end of this panel's discussion, I would be happy to say a few words from my side at that stage, not at this stage. Let me begin by requesting all my panelists to make sure that they stick to the time, given that we have a good number of speakers for this panel, so that everybody gets to have their say. And if there is a possibility of some time at the end of the panel's initial remarks for questions from the participants, to make it really interesting takeaway for all of us who are participating in this discussion. With that, let me request my senior colleague and old friend. I don't need to introduce him, absolutely not. Professor Madhav Nalapat, all of you have heard him, read him, and therefore I wouldn't try to introduce him at all. Let me invite Professor Madhav Nalapat to begin his remarks as first of the panelists. Professor Nalapat.
Thank you very much, Swaran. I'm grateful to you for this for this particular honor and of joining this panel. I think it's very clear a year into the Ukraine-Russia war that this has definitely been a transformational event. And a lot of individuals have pointed to various aspects of that transformation. There is no question about that. But allow me to spend a few minutes, and I hope I'll keep well within your time limits, Swaran, to some of the basic features that have really taken place during this war. In a way, I would like to say that the war has not really created a new dynamic so much as it has accentuated the existing dynamics. And where there was just, if I may say so, a small crack in the concrete, that is now widened into a chasm. So the existing cracks have widened into chasms, and those chasms have become visible. They cannot be ignored anymore. So, in a way, the war, it has not really created any new cracks, but it has widened the existing, several of the existing fault lines into chasms. And that is a very, very important development for every country, including India. And we have to be very, very cautious now that we don't inadvertently slip into any one of those chasms that have now opened up. Of course, as you very well know, and today the UN Security Council, the permanent membership, it's essentially there are two security councils now in terms of the permanent membership. There is Russia and China, and there is the United States, France, and Britain. So you have three on one side and two on the other. And these are entirely different security councils. If you look at the view from the two-member Security Council on several issues of the day, they are completely different from the views of the three-member Security Council on different issues of the day. And of course, as we all know, it is the permanent membership of Security Council that is the most influential in the Security Council, which again is the most important component of the United Nations organization. So the first thing this has done is basically to create a very visible and very deep division between Russia and China on the one hand, and between France, Britain, and the United States on the other. Now, this is being papered over verbally, it's being papered over in terms of diplomatic gestures, but this is the reality facing us, and this is a reality the world will have to live with for quite some time to come. That is the first point. The second point is a very significant event that has taken place in Russia. In Russia, for quite some time, I've been talking about the Moscow school and the St. Petersburg school. You know, when the capital of Russia was St. Petersburg, there was a European focus. And we saw that even in Mikhail Gorbachev, a common European home. I think Boris Yeltsin also had that similar viewpoint. And surprisingly, for some of us here, Vladimir Putin also had the viewpoint of this common European home. And for the first 6-7 years of his time as the president of Russia, he sought very hard to integrate Russia, the whole of Russia. And remember, Russia is half of Europe in size, half of Asia in size. Integrate the entirety of Russia into the quote-unquote common European home. Well, the St. Petersburg school has got several hard knocks along the way. And, you know, it essentially, the realization came even on Vladimir Putin, who is, by the way, very much suffused in that St. Petersburg tradition, that somehow the Russians are not going to be acceptable as part of the European family. Now, there are two reasons for this. And of course, I agree with this analysis. It's not going to happen. And there are two reasons for this. The first reason that some of us have been talking about for quite some time was that the entry of Russia into the European Union, for example, would ensure a complete dimming of the influence of the Franco-German alliance. The Franco-German alliance has been very key in the European Union. And now that Britain has left the European Union as a consequence of Brexit, once again, these two countries, if they work together, they have very powerful influence on European Union policy. If Russia were to come in, that would be upended. But the more important reason, as I mean, as time goes on, as events go on, obviously hypotheses also have to change. The more important situation is that the United States will not, frankly, want to see Russia integrated into Europe. And what is the reason for that? The reason for that is Europe is a very integral part of the United States system of alliances. The Chinese would call them subsidiary alliances. The US is more diplomatic, they call them alliances. But essentially, the issue is the same, having partners who are ready to follow your lead. And in the matter of Ukraine, I'd like to say the Europeans have certainly followed the lead of the United States, but specifically the Biden administration on the Ukraine conflict. So they will not want an integration of Russia into Europe. And therefore, they will oppose that, not openly perhaps, but in various ways. And that is why, even though Cold War 1.0 was over towards the close of 1991, with the demise of the USSR, the miasma of the Cold War 1.0 between the USSR and the US continues with the Russian Federation. There is still, if you look at the Ukraine conflict, it's almost like the Cold War of the 1970s, coming back to life. The 1980s, you had the period of Gorbachev, where frankly, it was a question of unilateral concession after unilateral concession. Somehow, I think Mikhail Gorbachev followed the example followed in India for quite some time of unilateral concession after unilateral concession, in the hope of essentially bribing the other side, the hostile side, into good behavior. It didn't work in the case of India. It has not worked in the case of Russia. Neither Gorbachev nor Yeltsin nor Putin in the beginning of his term were successful. But the fact is that there is no way the United States would want that kind of an event to take place, because the Russians would be a direct challenger to the primacy of the United States in Europe. And Europe is extremely important to the United States. If you look at it substantively, Asia and the Indo-Pacific are way more important, although, frankly, you have a large number of policymakers in the United States on not just the West Coast, but the East Coast, of course, completely, and not just the East Coast, but the West Coast as well, the parts in between as well, areas of Texas, for example, Atlanta, in Georgia, where the view is entirely in effect. The policy is crafted in a way which assumes that Europe and North America are basically the same continent separated by the waters of the Atlantic. That's not the case at all. But the way policy gets formulated is the implicit assumption is that of what Gorbachev said, a common European home, or a common North American come European home. So that was the situation facing Russia. And that situation is now clear in the Ukraine war, because the Ukraine conflict has been a very good wedge, if I may say so, to ensure that the Russians are separated from Europe. And very importantly, this has had a change, to a considerable extent, in European thinking about Russia. Even Germany, a country, frankly, whose commercial future depends on good relations with Russia, is now basically handicapping itself by trying to cut off from all Russian resource and sources, including energy. But the reality of the situation is that the Ukraine conflict has been a dream come true in one sense for the United States, in that it has ensured a break between Europe as such and Russia. Now, Ukraine and Belarus have been some of us have pointed out for quite some time, are critical to Russia in terms of being critical in terms of anybody who wants to launch a ground invasion of Russia will need to use either Ukrainian territory or Belarusian territory. The territory of which is now Ukrainian was previously Polish, but that was integrated into Ukraine by the Soviet Union at a time when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union after the Second World War, part of the winnings of the USSR in that particular war. Uh, so this is the situation now. Now, the St. Petersburg school is now completely discredited in Russia. And it is very, very clear that the Moscow school, which basically says, look, we are neither European nor Asian. We are Russian. I would not use the word Eurasian because that is a very common word in terms of geopolitics. It implies a fusion of, at least in the way I define it, the whole of Asia, the whole of Europe. So I'm not going to use that. But we are Russian. So we are neither Europeans or Asians. We are neither full Europeans or full Asians. We are something in between. And that I think is quite close to the truth. So that has now become gospel in Russia. And it is going to affect Russian strategic thinking, Russian attitudes to Asia, Russian attitudes to Europe, to the United States for quite some time to come. That's a very major transformation that the Ukraine war has basically been a catalyst of, and has really, that particular chasm has been widened in a very, very significant way. So that is one result of the Ukraine conflict. The second result is something which we again need to pay a lot of attention to. Now, you'll recall, Soran, that some of us have been were not very happy way back. You're talking about 2016, 17, 18, etc., at India looking and buying the S-400 defense systems. The point was that it was looking like an inevitable trajectory that in defense matters as well, the Russians and the Chinese will start working closely together. We all, I mean, those of us who are tech experts here, I'm not certainly, would know this far better, that where tech is concerned, it's very, very, and if you have a tech cooperation, putting in items that can ensure, for example, Trojans, let's put it that way, is not a very difficult task. So the closer the Russians get to the Chinese, the more easy it will be to have Trojans in Russian equipment. And that is where some of us have been arguing for quite some time that we need to have much bigger trade with Russia, but it should become less and less defense-based trade. Let's buy their oil. I am a complete supporter of the policy of Prime Minister Modi of buying as much Russian oil as you can get in the market. It's a very sensible thing for India to do, but let's not be, dependent on them for defense, for the simple reason, as defense systems go high-tech, it becomes easier and easier for a close ally of a particular country to ensure that those defense systems are in a manner that it gets some benefit from. And when you have two countries that are clearly hostile countries to India, Pakistan and China, and China is basically made almost a satellite of Pakistan. Now, Russia has become very dependent on China. From that point of view, defense relationship with Russia is a problem. Now, I do recall getting a tremendous amount of blowback. And of course, I must admit here, I was completely wrong about predicting that US sanctions would happen. In fact, at the highest level of the Indian government, they were very clear that the relationship between India and the US in particular was so important to both countries that there was no question of sanctions. As it turned out, the highest levels of the Indian government were right, and my forecast that there would be sanctions if we bought S-400 was wrong. But I would still stand by my view that we need to decouple ourselves in a graduated manner from defense equipment while basically boosting our purchases of Russian resources and material, which does not have a specific strategic or defense purpose. Now, this chasm, in a sense, between the West and Russia has also created an amalgamation of Russian and Chinese interests that we can see very, very clearly. At the time when this S-400 controversy was going on, it was not all that clear. And of course, the Russians, like good, when they're interested in selling their items, they would be very clear in the assurances that this is not going to happen. I wonder if those same Russians are going to say the same thing now, when Russia is obviously very dependent on China, not only as a consequence of its own actions, but also as a consequence of the reaction to the Ukraine conflict led by the United States and the UK, if I may say so. At that point in time, the UK reaction was basically because Boris Johnson saw the Ukraine conflict as a way of surviving as Prime Minister. The poor chap didn't succeed. He was very vocal about Ukraine, even more vocal than the Americans, but that didn't help him remain Prime Minister. But Rishi Sunak has also adopted more or less the same strategy as Boris. And a lot of the Europeans have had to adopt the same strategy. Essentially, it's the playbook of the Americans that keep Russia and Europe separate. And that playbook is working perfectly. The playbook of the Chinese is to make Russia dependent on China. And the Ukraine conflict has been extremely helpful to China in this regard, which is why some of us have been rather skeptical about the various reports that we read in the Western press about China playing a peacemaker role and Xi Jinping anxious to stop the Ukraine conflict. Xi Jinping is the biggest gainer from the Ukraine conflict. He wants to see a permanent rift between the West and Russia. And he is unhappy, frankly, that sanctions have not been brought on India. I think he was expecting sanctions and therefore expecting that the India-US relationship will start, showing tremendous tension. As a consequence of Prime Minister Modi and Joe Biden's wisdom, this has not happened. But the Chinese, basically, the American playbook has been satiated by Ukraine. The Chinese playbook has been satiated by Ukraine in another
Professor
matter.
Nalapat,
Yes, a few minutes, just a minute more.
sure.
Yeah, just a minute more.
Please.
So this is what I want to say, that this has been a transformational event, not in terms of creating any new fissures, but essentially in highlighting the reality, and I end here, Soren, of that we are in Cold War 2.0. I think you're smiling, and in fact, I'm glad you're only smiling because about 5 years ago, people were laughing when I talked about Cold War 2.0. And about 6-7 years ago, they were basically, worse than laughter, if I may say so. But the reality is, there is now a Cold War 2.0 between China and the major democracies in particular, of which India is very much a part. And I think the Ukraine conflict is showing that in Technicolor. Thank you, Swaran, for giving me this small leeway. Bless you.
Thank you, Professor Nalapat. I was smiling because of my predicament of having to stop you. They have given us 15 minutes each, and I think I therefore had to interject. I was listening to you with rapt attention, with excellent presentation that you made about the divide in UN Security Council, the disconnect that Russia now has with Europe, and how various other countries, major stakeholders, look at this conflict. I will now invite my very dear and young colleague from Goa University. Datesh Parlekar is someone I have worked with, and I have heard him earlier. And I am rather impressed with a very erudite young scholar from Goa University. And I'm looking forward to his speaking for 15 or less, since he's a friend of mine, I could even say that, on diplomacy, negotiations, and India's emerging role. Datesh, floor is yours now.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Swaran Singh. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. At the outset, pardon me for joining via the phone network because there are some civil works going on in my area as a result of Smart City. And so some of my Wi-Fi lines have snapped today. Be that as it may, I will straight dive into the brief that I have. And let me begin by putting forward a few points which I think are very pertinent in the context of the first anniversary of this particular conflict. This is a conflict with a localized battlefield, but a global strategic playfield. And I say this because when you look at what happened in the Caucasus with Azerbaijan and Armenia, if you see what has happened in the past, let's say in 2008, when Putin pulverized Georgia into submission, or for that matter, even when interstate disputes have become crises in the Horn of Africa, these battlefields have tended to be local and their implications also very, very limited. In the beginning, there was a feeling that this particular conflict also may be quite localized and may end very soon. But what we have seen as the first anniversary has passed is that this has truly become a global strategic playfield. We also see that this particular conflict tells us what a conflict means in an interconnected and interdependent world. You could not think of a more intertwined, complex conflict than this particular one, which essentially stems from conventional aspects of warfare to issues of food security, energy security, and every possible issue of global commons that impacts human security. What we also see is a deeply personalized. In fact, it has almost become like floors of Putin and Zelensky, and who will blink first. And this is one of the major problems if we are even trying to get to a potential negotiation or a potential resolution. Because while both sides have dug themselves into entrenched positions on the battlefield, it has also become a case of two stubborn egos and two very hard positions that have been taken, and neither of them can buckle from it. So it's a deeply personalized conflict like never before. But this conflict has also brought about, as Professor Nalapat very rightly said, a lot of diplomatic churn. We see a lot of fluidity of global politics, and more importantly, we see in West Asia and in Africa in particular, in the context of this conflict, what many writers have begun to talk about G0, which is essentially grouping zero, where countries are effectively looking to take positions and switch from multilateralism to minilateralism and move from group to group, essentially aligning their postures with what constitutes their immediate national interest. And this explains a lot of the fluidity of global politics, which has been exacerbated and accentuated by this particular conflict. But I would also say this conflict becomes particularly unique and very difficult to resolve because there are three economies at play. There is, as Professor Swaran Singh and Professor Nalapat alluded to, there is the conventional war economy, the military industrial complex, which is playing its own economy out. And until that satiates its quest, you can't see a solution on the horizon. But we also see equally a resources economy that is playing itself out, which is essentially a subset within the larger conflict that's playing out. But there is a third economy that has come to the table, and that is what I call as the economy of strategic autonomy. In fact, if you look at India's position of strategic autonomy, there are a lot of key economic decisions connected to strategic economy. And if anything, middle powers have understood that the economy of strategic autonomy is the way to navigate through this big power conflict, which is essentially what this war and conflict is all about. If you look at the axes that have developed, there are about 4 axes that have developed. One is the more routine one, which is the US-Russia big power conflict. Professor Nalapat alluded to it. It goes back to, both sides have allegations that neither side has given up on Cold War mentality. In fact, we saw that even in the case of Bush in Iraq, where he was accused essentially of falling prey to the Cold War hawks. But the point is, despite the US-Russia larger conflict at play, there is typically a Russia-NATO conflict that is playing itself out. And if there has to be any negotiation or resolution, it's almost a precondition that NATO and Russia will have to sit at the negotiating table and negotiate this conflict out, because at the bottom line, it is about red lines on both sides. But is it only these 2 axes? It's not. It's also a US-China conflict, with Russia being the player in the middle. And China is also using Russia in trying to keep the US distracted so that it can have a certain comfort zone in the East China Sea in terms of saber rattling and escalating the crisis with Taiwan. But there is also a 4th axis, which is the China-Russia axis against the US, that continues to get sharpened by the day. And I'll come to that a little later. Professor Nalapat spoke about traditional multilateralism, and it's very ironical that in this conflict, the tendency to go back to the United Nations and to find primacy in the United Nations has been that of the United States. The United States over the years has stood accused of circumventing the United Nations, of even flouting the United Nations, whether it's in Serbia, whether it's in Iraq. But here we see a very interesting scenario where traditional multilateralism is sought to be latched on to by Western countries who have used every opportunity to go back to the UN General Assembly because they knew nothing will happen in the UN Security Council, but to at least be able to name and shame Russia through traditional modes of multilateralism. So in some ways, there has been a taking of recourse to traditional multilateralism. This is balanced also by the challenges to new multilateralism. About 2.5 weeks ago, we saw the breakdown in Bangalore at the finance ministers meeting of the G20, and it effectively broke down over 2 paragraphs. And those 2 paragraphs are not about whether the Americans in the Western side wins or Russia wins. It's effectively over whether new multilateralism of today is going to constitute an intermediation of geopolitics and geoeconomics. Can the two and have the two got to intermediate in every conflict? And if that happens, it is very difficult to find negotiations because one side will want to bring in geopolitics into geoeconomics and the other side will want to keep these two in exclusive silos. I talked about the sharpening of the China-Russia axis, which is one of the most intriguing aspects and has implications for everyone. And we are seeing that in terms of currency multipolarity. The whole issue of currency multipolarity is not only about the Chinese and the Russians, but India as a middle power is also finding the latitude to practice its own currency multipolarity, whether it be in terms of continuing with the financial gateways through the dollar mechanism, moving to the ruble trade, but also being able to promote rupee trade, which it is now doing in a big way. So this currency multipolarity has got a leg up in the context of this particular conflict, and therefore it makes it even more difficult. And on this point, the last point on this section is that although the effort was to isolate and sequester Russia, it would be my contention that Russia has not been isolated. We have seen how countries who have adopted the price cap have been very limited. It's basically Europe, United States, and to some extent Australia and Japan. But even Japan has tried to finesse its position by trying to keep lines open. Much of Latin America, much of Africa, and much of the Indo-Pacific have stayed out of the price cap and have tried to maximize the advantage that comes from buying cheap Russian oil. So if you see this, I come to the second point of my presentation, which is how there could be negotiations and where could India be part of it, if at all India is part of it. The first thing, I would believe that we are getting towards what William Zartman, the famous theorist with regard to conflict resolution and management, called the mutually hurting stalemate. If we are either not there right now, we are probably getting closer to a point where both sides will realize that there is nothing to gain accepting incrementalism, because both sides seems to be dug into a kind of a status quo. And the status quo obviously is not going to be tenable to perpetuate beyond a particular point in time. However, this is not a battle only between the protagonists. It is in fact a battle being fought by the protagonists, but there are goaders and cheerleaders who ultimately hold the whip hand. And it would be my contention that while on the Ukrainian side, it is the United States that holds the whip hand, on the Russian side, to some extent, it is China that holds the whip hand in terms of how this particular thing will play itself out in the negotiating space. It's a war of attrition. And so a negotiated settlement or a conclusion to the war is essentially going to come if Russian resolve were to break at some point in time. If European pain were to get too big for Europe and too searing for Europe to continue this current trajectory, for the US to acknowledge at some point in time that the benefits now are being outweighed by the costs and there is a need to get back to the negotiating table. And I see the Blinken, talk with, or brief talk with Lavrov, in that particular context to try and keep some lines of communication open, but also how China harnesses this and to what extent China sees now the need to do away with this distraction for the United States. I believe a return to the Normandy format probably is untenable, because that happened in a particular point in time. And if there is one part of the world that has burnt its bridges with Putin, it is Europe. They hardly have an interlocutor now. They used to have Macron, they used to have Merkel, but now essentially the point is there are no bridges to be managed with Putin. And so the Normandy framework is out. So in a sense, European primacy in trying to bring a kind of a negotiated settlement is difficult. But any resolution, as I said before, would need three things. It would need certain degree of ironclad assurances from NATO about its expansion plans that can assuage the Russians. It obviously would need a very clear process by which Ukrainian neutrality is is preserved. But more importantly, the point is, how will Putin undo what he has done? He's not been seen as a person who undoes what he has done. And on the eastern Ukrainian provinces, which are what we call as the secessionist provinces, he has already legally, at least in the Russian legal form, he has absorbed them into Russia. So how are you going to undo that part to whatever extent it may be if a negotiated settlement has to happen? So it looks like there only has to be concessions on one side, and that's not how negotiations will happen. There is no credence and no trust, and so the confidence building measures are a problem. So where does India come in here? India definitely becomes attractive because India has access to Russia. But my question is access good enough to be a mediator or to play a part in negotiation? India may have access with Russia and good access with Russia, but does India have any leverage over Russia? And that's the big question mark. And I say this because India has had a long history of being part of many of these conflicts where we try to mediate, going back to Korea. But the point is, when we try to negotiate, we often look to negotiate through the medium of the United Nations. And there is no United Nations mediated process that will come to play in this particular conflict. Secondly, this conflict will not be resolved on rules of law. This conflict ultimately will get negotiated on rules of the game and terms of engagement. How comfortable India will be to be able to play a role in this kind of a negotiation where it doesn't have much experience remains to be seen. But I talked about leverage versus access, and I said that because if you look at the US role in the Israel-Palestine conflict, it was always said that the US is key to any solution, because not only does US have access with Israel, they also have leverage over Israel. India has access over Russia, but India may not have the leverage over Russia that probably China has, and that puts China in a much better position to be able to probably take their 12-point forward with some degree of certainty. The last couple of points that I would like to make is the fact that where India comes into the table is there are very few people who can talk to both sides today. There's probably been Erdogan who's been talking to both sides. There's been, of course, Xi Jinping and the Chinese who could talk to both sides. And there is India, which is talking to both sides. But I do see that India can be part of a solution, because under Prime Minister Modi, and I'm resting my case with that, India has shown the ability in its foreign policy to navigate some of the most difficult, mutually contradictory and paradoxical challenges to its foreign policy. And the best example is how it's negotiated through the minefield called the West Asia or the Middle East. It's been able to balance between relations with Iran, relations with the Gulf, and relations with Israel. And that is something that puts India in an absolutely enviable position. Similarly, India has stock on both sides, but how India will convert its access on both sides and the interlocution access that it has into real leverage, that will be something that we have to wait and see. I will stop here and I'll be happy to answer any questions subsequently. Thank you.
Thank you, Datesh, for keeping to the time. I think we are going very well so far. And I, again, must compliment you for keeping that very, very incisive approach to analysis on the issue that I ever hear you speaking on. I must say I enjoyed listening to you. The next speaker is again a very dear friend. He is much younger, but I met him almost 2 decades back, first time at a United Services Institutions international conference. Let me also first say thank you that some of you have switched on your videos. I would request as many of you, if you can switch on your videos, particularly members of Indic Research Forum, so that the speaker feels engaged. He's seeing who are the people he's addressing, rather than speaking to the black boxes on his screen. So please switch on your videos to make it more audio visual, which also means I would request participants to ask questions to panelists at end of their first initial remarks themselves by switching on their videos. And then I would avoid reading the text of each of your questions myself. Thank you. I see some of you have now switched on your videos. The next person in the panel is Dr. Satoru Nagao. And I again have heard him for almost 15 years plus now. Very incisive remarks, very sharp in his analysis. and a great friend of India. Sometimes I joke that he is like a young Shinzo Abe, because he is really very, very considerate and then very, deeply entrenched in India, in understanding India in that sense. Dr. Nagao, who's currently a fellow with Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. I don't, yes, I can perfectly see him like Shinkansen trains, they perfectly arrive on time. So he switched on his video as I just called him upon to come and speak. Dr. Nagao, floor is yours now, and you have 15 minutes to make your presentation.
It is honor for me to make presentation, and I learn a lot from the Professor Swaran Singh and the Professor Narapat, and I think I learn a lot from the other speakers, and so it is honor for me to make presentation in front of you. Generally, I use the PowerPoint, but today I will use the PowerPoint only 2 slides later, so maybe instead of this, I will speak. Today, I prepare the topics. Who could be the real winner of the Russia's aggression in Ukraine? So real winner is just a winner. Real winner is maybe a little different. Generally, the winner or loser of war is one side of the belligerent countries. But view from the reality, in some cases, real winner is not the belligerent countries. So, for example, the World War I, World War II, which country is a real winner? All British, France, Germany lost their power during the war. Instead of them, the United States expands their power. So, view from this, the real winner of the World War I and World War II is the United States. Another example is the Korean War. Both South Korea and North Korea suffered much. So in this case, both of two are not a winner. US and China succeeded to maintain the border around the 38th parallel of the latitude, but failed to occupy all Korean peninsula. This means that they are not a winner too. Indeed, which country? In my opinion, Japan has developed their economy because of the Korean War. That's why the view from this situation, real winner was Japan. So in case of the Russia's aggression in Ukraine, which country is the real winner? There's a possibility that this war will end like the World War I or Korean War. In case of World War I, regime change has happened and then the war. In case of the Korean War, both sides agreed and ceasefire and continue to face off. So in these cases, which country will be the real winner finally? In this case, there are some conditions of the real winner. In World War I, United States was the real winner if the United States is the real winner, because they increased their power and they did not suffer any loss. Any loss is maybe too strong, but anyway, they got more benefit than cost. In the Korean War, Japan was the real winner because they increased their power. In this case, economical power, but they did not suffer so much loss. So if so, which country could be the real winner of the Russia's aggression of Ukraine? Russia is losing their resources and declining their influences, that's true. Ukraine suffered much damages, it is no doubt. So both of them cannot be the real winner of this war. But how about NATO? How about China? Or how about the global south, including India in this case? We can check one by one. So in case of NATO, if there is a military power, economic, political power as one kind of the things we need to check as the real winner or not, NATO country gets all of 3, indeed, during this war. Firstly, if the war prolonged, they need to re-establish their strong defense industry to provide enough weapons to Ukraine. So in this case, NATO countries will get strong military power in the future. Secondly, NATO countries also get a strong economy because war itself could be the economic stimulus package. So in the prolonged war, there is a possibility they will increase the strong economy too. And thirdly, is NATO country has already proved how important their cooperation is. Before the Russia's aggression to Ukraine, there was the discussion NATO is an old framework. But now they proved how important. That is why the Finland, Sweden, or Ukraine or Georgia want to join. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, or Australia also want to be a partner of the NATO now. Therefore, NATO is expanding their influence in the world. This means that political power, NATO's political power is increasing. But if NATO will reorganize or reestablish the defense industry, indeed, defense industry demand a long-time process to be re-established. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill pointed out in his book, defense production demand a 4 years process. First year, defense industry, no production. Second year, a little production. Third year, many production. Fourth year, flood of production. So if so, this year is second year of Russia's aggression to Ukraine. Defense industry cannot produce so many. No economic stimulus effect this year. But if war continue, third year, fourth year, situation will change. So how long the war continue? It will be the decisive factor. For China, indeed it could be the same. If China supports Russia by providing weapons, it could be the military economic stimulus packages for China. In addition, Russia relies on China both economically and militarily. If so, China can expand their influence to control Russia. As a political power, China will be the bigger country. This means that China could be the real winner too. Therefore, I do not say the NATO or China intended to prolong the war as a policy. This is one kind of coincidence things. But it is also true that prolonged war could give them more chance to increase power. And strong military, or strong economy, or strong political power, there's a possibility they can get the influence. They can get the influence to be the leading country in the world because of this war. So how about Global South, including India? In this case, India has taken a distance from this war. India is seeking the voice of the Global South. So can India to become the real winner of this war? Currently, the Global South suffered much by rising living costs. Indeed, that is a serious issue. And most countries of Global South cannot produce a weapon to sell. India can produce to sell, but other country, most of the country, hasn't got enough level of the technology or defense industry to produce weapons. So it is not easy to get a benefit to export arms. However, compared with the past, some countries improve their capability to produce. That's also true. For example, the Iran, for example, the North Korea exported weapons to Russia. They got the benefit. So in the past, we could not expect that Russia rely on Iran or North Korea. So some countries, the global south has their capability, enough level of the defense industry to get the benefit. That's true. If the war continue next some years. So, viewed from such kind of situation, what can I say? It is true. Now is the time for the defense industry. To be a real winner, all countries in the world, including India, was Japan also, needs a strong defense industry. In case of India, India has already achieved indigenous development tanks, nuclear submarines, fighter jet, missiles. Yeah, this is a very strong point of India. So India has the potential to be the real winner. That's true. But even if the Russia that has a relatively strong defense industry, they cannot fulfill the huge demand of war. That is why they improved the weapon. They imported weapon. Sorry, they imported weapon from Iran and North Korea or China. So therefore, now is the time for international cooperation. Without international cooperation, no country can be the real winner in this age. So defense industry of like-minded countries should collaborate each other and establish the tough supply chain of weapons. Such cooperation made us real winner. So which country will be the good partner or good partner to collaborate with India? In this case, yes, if the NATO or China is the only choice, of course NATO is better. Because for a long time, India has imported many weapons from Soviet Union and Russia. That's true. However, since the end of the Cold War, Russia has started to export China many weapons. So in this case, finally, I want to show the some slide I made. Wait seconds. No. The problem is how to control this. No. Okay. I understand. I cannot share the slide because I cannot understand how to share. What should I do?
Sir, you can share it with us and we can do it for you.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I skip the share. I cannot understand how to. Generally, Google Meet, I can do it, but yeah, there are no lines of my data. Okay. Okay, what kind of figure I made? The price base using the database of the CIPRI, the think tank in Sweden. The monetary basis, how much weapons Russia sell to China and the Soviet Union sell to China. Since the 1990s, Russia started to re-export weapons to China, and it has increased. That is what I want to say. So now Russia is the main supplier, weapon supplier to China. And of course, Russia also sold the weapon to India. But Russia's logic is like that. The weapons Russia sold to India is better than the weapon Russia sold to China. But how to confirm this? Because this is military secret. It is impossible to prove it. That's why Russia cooperate with China and India at the same time. That is the real situation. So can India trust Russia as a security provider or weapon supplier? That is a controversial issue, I think. In case of Pakistan, it is same. Indeed, along with the Russia-China cooperation recently, Pakistan import the new fighter jet from China or the co-production with China, JF-70 or J-10. But engine is made in Russia. Engine of this fighter jet is Russian arms. MiG-35 attack helicopter of the Pakistan army also made in Russia. So Russia started to sell the weapon to Pakistan. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union hesitated to export weapons to Pakistan because that time they care about India. But after the Cold War, situation is different, especially recently, last decade. They have changed. So they have started to export weapons to both China and Pakistan, and India faces this threat. So that's why India cannot rely on Russia anymore, I think. But as one of the weapon sources, of course, India will continue to buy weapons from Russia. That is understandable. As a card, it is also useful to negotiate with others. That's also understandable. And but at the same time, Russia is not the partner now, I think. So I'm Japanese. Japanese do not trust Russia, that's true. But at the same time, yes, the data show such kind of situation. So Japan, in case of Japan, it is easy. We are the NATO side. We stand with Ukraine in this case. That is very simple. But in case of India, India is a more controversial stance. But at the same time, as a Japanese, I want to say, India has another friend. We can be the friend. We can be the friend, and we are not alone. We are a bigger group. US, Australia, we can hold a Quad. And now we have with other Asian rights, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, or Southeast Asia countries. We cooperate with Vietnam and Indonesia also. With these countries, we want to create something bigger network of cooperation. Under such kind of situation, we want to cooperate with India with these friends, like-minded countries against China, and China control Russia. So that is the reason now the Australian PM visit India. Japanese Prime Minister Kishida will visit India. It will happen next some weeks. So the time is coming to cooperate more deeply. And this is, of course, India's decision is India's decision. We cannot control it. India should, but India could be the real winner of this war. That's why we want to go with India together. Now, that is what I want to say. India's capability is rising very fast. India will be the independent, strong power. That's true. But at the same time, we want to work together. That is what I want to say as a friend of India. Thank you very much.
so much.
I should stop it.
Thank you, Dr. Nagao. It's a pleasure to have you on this panel, and nice to hear you that despite the variance between Japanese and Indian positions, you are able to still highlight the linkages and close connect that Japan and India share. I have the pleasure now to invite someone I've been looking forward to listening to, Professor Alexander Dachak. We are lucky he's going to share with us perspective from Russia. I've had chance to read a couple of his pieces, and I'm aware of his argument of United States using Ukraine war to sort of financially weaken Russia. But I think some of you may be aware that the real advantage is that Alexander Dachak actually, if I'm right, comes from Kyiv. And therefore, we are lucky to have this interesting perspective from someone who represents Russia, but also with enormous experience of life in Ukraine. And he's seeing his own city, being sort of under the enormous violence. And I therefore look forward to listening to his analysis on as he talks about Russia's approach to war and the geopolitical assessment. Floor is yours, Dr. Dachak, and you have 15 minutes. Dr. Dachak, you can hear me? Alexander, are you able to hear me as I speak?
I think there must be some network issues from his side.
Okay, so I think we may have to go to the next speaker, and if Alexander is back with us, we will, of course, we still have time, and we will look forward to listening to him. And I think with that, let me request Dr. Hans Jakob Schindler, if he's with us now. Yes, I can see him. So nice of you to switch on your video, and I'm sure that we have a speaker with us. And Professor Schindler is going to speak on Russia-Ukraine war and the rise of the right-wing extremists. And I think that also is going to be a very interesting presentation from someone who is on the counter-terrorism, counter-extremism project and former coordinator of sanctions monitoring team. Let me request now to Dr. Schindler to make his presentation in 15 minutes. Floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Chair. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate, as always, the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be and an honor to be with you. As already mentioned, I'm the Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project CP, and I would like to start my remarks with a few sentences about my organization. We are a privately funded, non-partisan, transnational think tank and advocacy organization that focuses on a wide range of ideologically motivated violence, from violent right-wing extremism all the way to Islamist terrorism. We do research in-house as well as with international partners in Europe and North America, and since 2019 have built up a particular expertise in the transnational violence-oriented right-wing extremism movement, as well as the effects that the conflict in war in Ukraine had on this movement. You can find a lot of reports and policy papers on these issues on our website, and I'm pleased to be able to present a summary of our work at this event. The effects of the Russian-Ukrainian war, which in effect already started in 2014 with the first conflict between Russian-backed forces in Ukraine, including the annexation of Crimea by Russia, on the right-wing extremist networks and groups in Europe, needs to be seen in a broader context. Therefore, my short remarks will concentrate on 4 issues. First, the changing role of Central and Eastern European, including Russian right-wing extremist networks, for the overall transnational right-wing extremist movement during the past 15 years. Second, the first episode of this ongoing war between 2014 and 15. And then lastly, the current situation and its short, medium, and long-term challenges. Let me therefore start with the rising importance of right-wing extremist networks in Central and Eastern Europe, including in Russia. Starting around a decade and a half ago, new right-wing extremist narratives allowed for a shift in how the overall right-wing extremist milieu functioned. These narratives, such as the Great Replacement or white genocide, allowed for a redefinition of what the perceived enemies are from hyper-nationalist approaches, which essentially saw all foreigners as enemies, to a broader national, transnational definition. Now, foreigners can still be enemies, but also allies, while enemies are defined as, for example, liberal politicians, LGBTQ+ activists and civil society activists, proponents of globalization, and anyone else deemed to be actively working to destroy an imagined white Anglo-Saxon European Christian culture. This also means that right-wing extremists can now cooperate with their counterparts in other countries, including in Central and Eastern Europe, far more easily than in the past, because now the fight is not primarily against all foreigners, but only against some foreigners, and this perceived sense of common enemies allows for intensive transnational cooperation. At the same time, within Central and Eastern Europe, including Russia, shifts within the right-wing extremist networks occurred. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, right-wing extremists in Central and Eastern Europe began to look towards Western Europe for inspiration and model themselves on Western networks. This reversed in the last 15 years, and now Central and Eastern European networks, including Russian networks, serve as models and inspiration for Western European, even American right-wing extremist networks. This new role manifests itself in 2 aspects. First, offline. Key events in the transnational right-wing extremist networks happen in Central and Eastern Europe. For example, the Polish Independence Day March every year on 11th of November, which is the largest gathering of right-wing and far-right extremist activists in Europe and North America. Furthermore, with the development of a distinct Russia-friendly strand within the right-wing extremist networks in Europe, Russian groups, such as the Russian Imperial Movement, RIM, have begun to play a major role. For example, prior to a string of attacks on Swedish migrant homes in 2015-16, the perpetrators, which are linked to the Nordic resistance movement, NRM, trained with the Russian Imperial movement near St. Petersburg. Furthermore, the Russian Imperial movement is currently suspected to be the driving force behind a letter bomb campaign by Spanish right-wing extremists in November and December last year. Online, several Russian social media sites such as VKontakte are increasingly adopted by European right-wing extremists as they perceive these platforms to be a more permissive online environment than Western platforms. Therefore, even before the start of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia in 2014, and long before the reinvasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, the role of Central and Eastern European networks, including Russian ones, had already increased significantly. The first episode of the war against Ukraine in 2014 had a noticeable impact on European right-wing extremist networks, but slightly different than is commonly reported. My organization, the Counter-Extremism Project, has studied in depth the profiles of the first wave of foreign fighters that came to the conflict zone in 2014. What is clear is that this wave, unlike the wave in 2022, which I will address in the final part of my remarks, was largely from right-wing extremist milieux. It is interesting to note, and remains underreported, that those extremist volunteers joined both sides of the conflict, i.e. the Ukrainian as well as the Russian-backed separatist side of the conflict. This was due to the fact that in 2014, extremist volunteers saw the conflict in Ukraine not primarily as a political one, pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian, but as a conflict in which right-wing extremists could join to gain combat training and battlefield experience. This has to be understood in the context of the much larger wave of foreign terrorist fighters that traveled to Syria and Iraq to join the Islamic State. Ukraine was simply the conflict that right-wing extremists saw that they could join instead. Therefore, it was not uncommon that extremists from the same right-wing extremist networks in Europe would be joining both sides of the conflict. It largely depended on what the individual perceived as the side of the conflict that he, when there were no significant numbers of females joining, could reach more easily, or which outfit on which side of the front would be willing to have him. Much has been reported about the Azov battalion and the rights sector in Ukraine that had formed private militias in 2014, accepting foreign right-wing extremists into their ranks. While this is correct, what is generally misunderstood is that already in late 2014, the Ukrainian government began to integrate private militias, including right-wing extremist-leaning militias, into the official structure of the Ukrainian security forces. This had two effects. On the one hand, these now official formations were no longer allowed to include foreigners, effectively closing the door for foreign extremists to take part in the conflict in a fighting unit. On the other hand, it also forced a process of de-ideologization of these former militias, as official units, similar to other Ukrainian security forces, were now part of the official command and control structure and were not allowed to espouse political or ideological views. As an outward expression of this, the name Azov Battalion changed to Azov Regiment. Therefore, if you read media reports or commentary naming the unit Azov Battalion after 2014, it's a clear indication that the knowledge of the author of this piece about the actual situation is less than rudimentary. Another outward expression of this process was the formation of the Azov movement, which consisted of those hardline right-wing extremists that used to be the members of the Azov battalion, but left or were forced to leave the unit when it became an official part of the security forces in Ukraine. This Azov movement, despite a similar name and despite displaying some of the insignia of the Azov regiment, was distinct and is distinct from the regiment and an ideologically right-wing movement with political ambitions. Between 2016 and 19, the Azov movement indeed became a major player in the transnational violence-oriented right-wing extremist movement. Not only did the Azov movement actively attempted to network internationally with other right-wing extremists, but with the Askardai Festival, an annual National Socialist Black Metal Festival in Kiev, Ukraine, it provided a major networking hub for transnational right-wing extremists beyond Ukraine. However, since 2019, the fortunes of the Azov movement in Ukraine withered. On the one hand, the Azov movement stopped attending conferences and meetings abroad, and the Ukrainian government took a closer look on the activities of foreign right-wing extremists traveling to Ukraine and, for example, barred US members of the right-wing extremist Atomwaffen Division from entering the country in 2020. Furthermore, the Azov movement participated in national elections in Ukraine in 2019 as part of a broad coalition of right-wing political movements. This coalition, which included the Azov movement, gained a total of 2.12% of the vote in the national contest, demonstrating its extremely limited appeal to Ukrainian voters. Therefore, by the end of 2021, the Azov movement stance in Ukraine, as well as its role in the transnational right-wing movement, had greatly diminished. However, the reinvasion of Ukraine by Russia changed this situation. Nothing breathes life more into the corpse of fascist movements than conflict and war, which brings me to the final part of my short remarks. As far as the current war in Ukraine is concerned, there is one short-term to medium-term, two medium to long-term, and one long-term consequence or challenge as far as right-wing extremism is concerned that are already visible. In difference to 2014, in February 2022, the Ukrainian government officially called for foreign volunteers to join the conflict in support of its cause. This led to several thousand volunteers to travel to Ukraine, among them a few hundred foreign right-wing and left-wing extremists. However, as demonstrated in our latest report, which will come out in a few days, this current cohort of foreign volunteers and foreign fighters is far less ideologically motivated than the cohort in 2014 was. Nevertheless, among those foreign volunteers are some right-wing extremists that did not travel to Ukraine primarily to support Ukraine, but to gain combat training and experience, access to arms and ammunition, as well as explosive material, and therefore are likely to return home sooner or later. Therefore, the short to medium consequence of the war in Ukraine is how to deal with these extremist potential returnees. Having a violence-oriented extremist with combat training experience and increased international networks, as well as better access to arms and ammunition and explosive materials due to their networks in the conflict zones returning to their home countries, is a clear security threat, even if we are only talking about a limited number of individuals. These potential returnees are primarily a security concern for European governments. Interestingly, US right-wing extremists who had traveled to Ukraine early in the war have already largely returned home, and it's telling that the US right-wing extremist networks now adopt a neutral stance to the conflict. They argue that they do not want to be involved in brother wars, but concentrate on the situation in the US. The first medium to long-term consequence of the war is its effects on the overall transnational right-wing extremist movement. Overall, the war in Ukraine did not alter the general split of the transnational right-wing extremist movement, which falls into two camps, the pro-Russian camp and the anti-Russian camp. The conflict also did not result in infighting between these two general camps outside Ukraine. However, what is happening is the rise of Russian right-wing extremist movements. These are openly fighting on the Russian side of the front, supported and encouraged by Russia. Groups such as the Russian Imperial Movement and the Rasich Group are operating on the front, in part in cooperation and alongside the Wagner Group, and therefore have now abundant access to arms, ammunition, and explosive materials. As outlined in the first part of my remarks, Russian right-wing extremist networks have increased their role within the transnational right-wing extremist networks for a number of years already before the conflict, and their now new semi-official role on the front against Ukraine is bolstering their influence even further. Given that the Russian Imperial Movement has already a history of training Swedish right-wing extremists before they conducted attacks in Sweden, and is currently suspected of being behind the driving force between right-wing extremists, the right-wing extremist-led bomb campaign in Spain at the end of last year, rolling back the influence of right-wing extremist networks will be a necessary but very challenging endeavor. A second medium to long-term consequence relates to the mono-ethnic military units in Ukraine, consisting of Belarusian and Russian individuals. These units are led by Russian and Belarusian extremists that are staunchly opposed to their governments in Belarus and Russia and have broader war aims than the current war. They clearly see this current conflict as a preparation to bring the war back home after the war in Ukraine dies down. Therefore, the management of these Russian and Belarusian right-wing extremists is a challenge that the Ukrainian government will have to face sooner or later. Finally, there is also a much broader long-term consequence of this war. This relates to commercially available paramilitary training facilities in Central and Eastern Europe. Already following the start of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in 2014, governments in Central and Eastern Europe saw this as an imminent threat also to their territorial integrity and ramped up paramilitary training facilities in their countries. While the state-owned paramilitary training facilities are not of concern when it comes to the transnational right-wing extremist movements in Central and Eastern Europe, they also allowed the expansion of privately funded training facilities. As our research demonstrates, these commercially run facilities do by and large not conduct customer due diligence, meaning anyone who wants to get trained and can get trained will get trained at these facilities. During the past few years, violence-oriented right-wing extremist individuals from several European countries have used these facilities, including, for example, the right-wing extremist who perpetrated the shooting in Hanau in 2020, which killed 10 people, obtained paramilitary training in a commercial facility in a Central European country. Given the significant increase in paramilitary training facilities that occurred in response to the much smaller Russian intrusion into Ukraine in 2014, it is likely that such facilities in Central Europe will continue to increase now as a result of the much larger Russian invasion of 2022. Therefore, better European regulation of commercial training, paramilitary training facilities, including regulation who can obtain what training and what kind of paramilitary training, minimum standards for customer due diligence at these commercial facilities, as well as increased information exchange between European governments will be necessary to better mitigate the risks emanating from such commercial facilities in the long term. This really concludes my introductory remarks. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Schindler, for your excellent remarks about right-wing extremism and how they are undergoing the combat training during this war, and ultimately when they return back to where they came from, as to how the social fabric of those nations, of the political challenge that it could throw up, would be a follow-up or fallout of the Ukraine war, as in when it comes to a close. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. I must apologize, Alexander, we had to move to the next speaker because we were not able to hear you, and I think we had briefly lost connection with you. If you can hear me now, I would now request you to take the floor and make your presentation. I personally have been looking forward to your view from both sides of the conflict, and therefore, I think, like me, many others are also looking forward to listening to you. I hope internet helps us to make sure we are able to hear you loud and clear. Let me request you now to begin making your remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the second chance. So I tried to be quicker. The conflict in Ukraine has had a serious impact on the world economy and international relations. The West, primarily the United States, has tried to use this conflict to solve this problem at the expense of the rest of the world. The events that have taken place in the year since the beginning of the conflict have only confirmed the validity of the decision taken by the Russian leadership. War was inevitable. The losses among the civilian population of Donbass in Russia would have been disproportionately greater in Russia if Russia had not launched the preemptive strike a year ago. Forward movement of the Russian army is hindered largely by the fact that Russia does not consider it possible for itself to use such tactics as the United States had during the war, for example, in Iraq, when carpet bombing destroyed entire cities regardless of civilian casualties. Russia does not believe that the people living on territory controlled by Kiev are enemies. The fact confirms that 7 million people have left Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict. About 3 million have left for Russia. It would be more if Ukraine didn't shoot cars with the people who were moving towards the Russian or Belarusian border. And people who have crossed the Russian border have no chance to returning home. They are guaranteed prison in Ukraine because of Russian stamp in their passports. Even strikes on infrastructure facilities and headquarters of the armed forces of Ukraine are carried of point-wise sparing civilians. If civilians casualties do occur, it is from the action of Ukrainian air defense. I would like to say about name of forum. Still, it was right. Sorry, still it was right not to talk about the Russian-Ukrainian war. It is the war of collective West against Russia, a war of attraction and destruction. They themselves talk about it openly. More than 50 countries controlled by the United States are waging war against Russia, contrary to common sense of and their own interests. We see this from the gathering of NATO organized criminal group with the involvement of other accomplices. Countries that do not have state sovereignty, forced to dance to the tune of Washington. At the same time, they insist that they are not parties of the conflicts. Such a statement is a lie. They also understand this. Direct supplies of weapons, from small arms to armored vehicles, MLRS, and aviation, providing communication and intelligence, including space, mercenaries, and instructions. Ukraine has a deep hinterland. Its units are trained in many countries of the world, from Poland to the United States. Is this not a direct participation in the conflict? Let's remember the story. In 1941, the Soviet Union was attacked by United Europe. That European Union that's united by Nazi Germany, the Third Reich. Now the Fourth Reich is waging war against Russia under the control of Washington. Already then 50 countries in 1944-45, when the Red Army was smashing the fascist hordes already in Europe, all the countries that participated in the 1941 attack began to refuse to participate in the war on the side of Germany. Even Finland turned its bayonets to the west against the Wehrmacht. The countries of Eastern Europe sided with the Soviet Union and formed their units as a part of Red Army. So it will be in this conflict the same. Russia cannot lose. We have no chance. We have no choice and no chance of defeat. As the President Putin said, why do we need a world in which there will be no Russia? At the same time, Russia does not threaten anyone outside its historical territory. And not Russia started the conflict, which began in 2014 with the coup in Ukraine. After those events, total external control was established over Ukraine, and the pumping of weapons and population with Nazi ideology began. And the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine will only increase the death toll. But this is one of the goals of the West, the cleansing of the territory from the Slavic population. If you conduct the genetic examination, Russians and Ukrainians will have absolutely no difference. Russians are killing Russians. Anglo-Saxons' dreams has come true. And Ukraine is used only as a screen. Ukraine can't be called as an independent state. It can't be called a state at all. This is only territory with a set of resources that the United States has deprived of sovereignty. They also look at the population only as a resource for waging war against Russia. The country's budget, Ukraine budget, is formed by 60% of external loans. It will be never to be able to pay off its debt. There is no calculation for it. If Ukraine survives by some miracle, it will give up the territory to pay its debt. In fact, the territory has already been sold, and Ukraine is already selling the land. The soil is taken out by wagons, as it was during the Second World War by Nazis. Ukraine is being robbed in every possible way. With the help of the grain deal, grain is exported to for a song, but not to the poorest countries, but to feed Spanish pigs for the sake of ham. Thanks to Ukrainian grains, it was possible to bring down the food inflation in the European Union. Under the guise of grain deal, weapons are being supplied to Ukraine in ships. The West imposed sanctions against Russia with the expectation that Russia would not cope with the sanctions. However, after the first days of hesitation after the introduction of sanctions, Russian power reacted quickly enough to new challenges. And if the actions of the Central Bank of Russia in the very first days after the announcement of sanctions had been more decisive, then even a jump in the exchange rate of national currency would not have been involved. Nevertheless, the rate quickly returned to the usual level, and Russia economy shrunk by 2.1% in 2022. There is no shortage of almost all goods in Russia. At least you will not notice the difference between the filling of shelves in Russian stores if you were in the country before the conflict and the current state. One can even express gratitude to the United States as the initiator of anti-Russian sanctions for the introduction of such measures. Now Russia is spared the need to comply with the conditions unfavorable to it imposed on it back in the early 19th by the International Monetary Fund. Russia is restoring economic sovereignty. Production facilities are being created to replace the product of Western corporations. Unfortunately, this was not done in 2014, when after the coup d'etat in Ukraine organized by the West, when sanctions were imposed against Russia. But better later than never. The Russian economy has demonstrated stability, and Russian society is consolidating unprecedented since the Great Patriotic War that was, we call the Second World War. The light didn't converge of the Western countries like a wedge. Russia is developing mutually beneficial relations with the BRICS and SCO countries, which are successfully replacing Western manufacturers in the Russian market. There is a reorientation of Russian suppliers of raw materials to other markets. The process of the dollarization of the economy is underway. A new geopolitical reality is being formed. BRICS and SCO are new forms of interactions between states. It is based on respect for the interest of each participant, obtaining benefits together and not at the expense of another, making decisions by the consensus and not under the dictates of the strongest. This form of cooperation is becoming increasingly popular. It contrasts with the model imposed by Washington, whereas where there is an imposition of its will in the interest of the main participant, where the beneficiary is only one, and the left get crumbs from his table. Another of the goals that Washington is achieving with the war in Ukraine is elimination of competitor in the face of European Union. The products of European commodity producers are losing competitiveness due to the high energy prices, which have grown because of the reason invented by Washington. Capital flows to the United States and Asia. Previously, the great state of Germany and France has completely lost their sovereignty. The West, that is the USA, is quite satisfied with a long-term conflict in exhaust Russian Europe. The United States is loading up its military-industrial complex, while even high-tech weapons production in European countries will be eliminated. The USA need time. They need a conflict for 5 years minimum. What will happen with the people of Ukraine and Russia doesn't matter. More killed, more money. A few words about territories liberated from Ukrainian troops. Infrastructure is residential building being rapidly restoring. People are returning to their cities, their homes. Unfortunately, we abandoned some territories liberated by the Russian army again. They who were suspected of cooperating with the Russian authorities, the Kiev's power stage mass executions. Moreover, these are often just doctors, teachers, cafe workers, post officer workers, flight guards, people of absolutely non-political professions. The countries that support Ukraine should know that they openly support the Nazi regime. They support a rigid dictatorship in which one can lose freedom and life for words that doesn't coincide with the ideology of Nazi regime, for having a Soviet or Russian symbols at home, for book of Christian contents of the Russian Orthodox Church, for Russian phone number in their phone books. In the West, if the West had not sponsored Kiev regime, Ukraine would have moved to the restoration of the territory long ago. Hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved. Russia has no other option but to win. And it's too early to talk about peace talks. We remember how the Minsk agreement, first and the second, the attempt of Istanbul agreements were used. Such negotiations can be used again only to strengthen Ukrainian army, pumping in with new types of weapons. America needs time for the military-industrial complex to reach full capacity. Leaving the state of Ukraine with a pro-Western Nazi government like the current one is only postponed a big problem in the future. We can only talk about the termination of the existence of this regime. Mr. Darish Puri-Lekarar, restoration of the Normandy format is impossible. France and Germany have discredited themselves. Merkel and Poroshenko openly stated that they were deceiving Putin in order to gain time to strengthen the Ukrainian army. And Mr. Makhav Nalapat talk about separation of Russia from Europe. We are happy to be separated from Europe. We don't want to share with them so-called European values with their LGBT propaganda, satanism, and sex education in kindergarten. So thank you very much. I hope the war in soon will be finished by the win with fighting with Nazi regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. I'm happy we could finally hear you. With that, our panelists have completed their initial remarks. Just to have a quick recap of all the 5 speakers in just one sentence each, if I have to tell some of you who joined, I saw some of you join just recently, you've been going in and out. Professor Madhav Nalapat started by talking of the divide that is happening in multilateral institutions. He spoke of UN Security Council being divided. He spoke of the disconnect, as Alexander just reminded us, that US has perhaps achieved within Russia and Europe, at least the NATO Europe. Then we had Dr. Datesh Parulekar, who reminded us of the Normandy plan, and he spoke of the interesting leverages versus access that various stakeholders have with the main contenders in that conflict, and underlined that India has access but not perhaps leverage when it comes to India's relations with Russia. Dr. Satoru Nagao made a very interesting presentation by saying, let's look at who are the winners of these major wars, and he started by underlining United States as winner of the Second World War and First World War, Japan as a winner of the Korean War, and raised interesting question: who are likely candidates to be seen as winners of the ongoing war in Ukraine? Then, of course, we heard Dr. Schindler underlining the rise of right-wing extremism, their injection into the conflict, indeed from both sides, and how they are being further sort of skilled in terms of combat fighting, and what it means at end of the termination of conflict, and sort of return to their respective societies and countries, and how it will impact. And of course, Alexander, we are happy we could finally listen to you. And you, of course, brought out views that as I said, I had read 1 or 2 of your pieces before. You look at this as basically United States and its friends and allies war against Russia. Indeed, I was reminded of President Joe Biden's recent speech in Warsaw City, where he did underline that he's put together a coalition of 50 countries that are supporting Ukraine in that war. And I was happy to see that, sort of you were able to put your point across. I'm sure there'll be questions to you. Now, something that I'm going to say at this stage is that we have plenty of time. In fact, I want to make sure that participants get to have their say as well. And I want to encourage all of you to sort of make your comments or your questions. I will be even willing to spare some of chair's time given to me to speak at end. But I want to encourage participants to also intervene and make their statements, make their comments and ask questions. A second request I have now is that maybe at this stage, all the panelists could switch on their videos so that we can have a view of them being with us. And then, of course, participants could ask questions. Another request, whenever any of you is asking a question, you must introduce yourself so that the speaker has an idea from where the question is coming. And of course, if you have a specific question to a specific panelist, do let us know that this question is meant for a specific panelist. I noticed that Argish Akolkar has had questions for, I think, all the panelists that we have on this panel. So I will ask Argish to begin by himself. I see that his video has suddenly disappeared. He was with us throughout.
Hello, sir.
And he wants, yeah. So yes, Argish, you may start by asking your questions to each of the panelists. I would request panelists to take roughly around 2 minutes in answering each of the questions so that we can have more questions and more discussion, and maybe second attempt by same participant to ask another question. Argish, you could start with your questions and then we'll ask each of the panelists to respond to your questions.
Yes, sir. So I will skip the question which I had presented for Dr. Nalapat, sir. I don't think he's there. So.
Okay, I think Dr. Nalapat is not with us now, but he might rejoin. And if he rejoins, we'll ask him. You could ask questions to other panelists.
Yes, sir. So my question for Professor Perulakar was, hello, sir. You had highlighted the importance of leverage against Russia to play the important role of being a negotiator in the crisis. Can we see the increasing oil purchases and possibly further raw material imports from Russia acting as the prospective leverage?
Yeah, thank you,
Dr.
Argish, for your
Pavlikar?
question. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for your question. There's no doubt that there has been an endeavor in the past couple of years. I mean, the December 2021 visit of President Putin to India was unique in the sense that there was a very conscious attempt to diversify and productivize the bilateral relationship. However, despite the fact that we have catapulted up the sweepstakes of purchasing oil from Russia, and possibly will eclipse China as well very soon in terms of our purchases from them, there is a good reason to believe that this is really a cyclical kind of a process and not something where we are strategically ordaining ourselves to Russian oil. I think when the situation kind of normalizes, the oil market will find its own levels and we will go back to purchasing from wherever we get the cheapest. So it's not a given that this is going to be necessarily leverage. At this point in time, when I said leverage, I was trying to say leverage in the context of what can bring dependency upon Russia. For example, Russia has been isolated by the West. Whom can it rely on? Definitely one of the countries it may rely on is India, but clearly there is a lot more leverage that China has with Russia right now than we do. In terms of the overall productivization, the problem that we face, unlike China, and that is why the leverage issue becomes important, even though we have chosen strategic autonomy and that means we have prioritized our relations with Russia, we are always nuancing it to ensure that we are not on the wrong side of the West. Whereas China doesn't have that kind of, any kind of limitation. It can actually choose both sides and have its own stakes and eat it too. Because of that, I do believe that despite the fact that we may look to build leverage, the only place where we may have some degree of influence, and I'm not saying leverage, is in the defense sector. But that's an area where, as Professor Nalapat said as well, that is a compulsive leverage or influence that we may not want to have, because that is something where even we are forced into a certain dependency. So I would say that despite the endeavor to broaden our relationship with Russia, in terms of trade, and we know the difficulties that exist there. It's been tried for a long time, but we have not really been able to break through the kind of barriers. I don't see any specific leverage that India has, which makes India totally relevant to the current situation or to be able to bring about a negotiation. The only thing that India can bring to the table is a lot of goodwill. But I think the point is we have to move beyond goodwill. And I think the best example is what happened just yesterday with regard to China sneaking in and doing managing to get both the Saudis and the Iranians on the table. So while we may have a lot of goodwill going around, goodwill is not what matters. The ability to be able to drive home your national interest also matters. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
sir.
Dr. Nagao. If you're with us and you're listening to me, please switch on your video so that we can ask you questions also. Argish, go ahead with your next question.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir. Hello, Dr. Nagao, sir. My question was,
Hello.
what has been the effect of this conflict for Taiwan, and especially what can be the lessons for Taiwan with the impending prospective impending invasion by the People's Republic of China?
Okay, this is a very important question, and indeed, many people in Japan also concerned about this situation. 1 year ago, when the Russia started invasion, the people start worried if the United States need to spend much military resources in the Europe, there is a possibility China will get the chance to invade Taiwan because US cannot share enough defense forces in the Pacific side and to defend Taiwan. Maybe such kind of situation we're worrying. But view from the current situation, it hasn't happened yet. Because one thing, one important thing has happened is before Russia invaded Ukraine, the only experts understand the situation and pointed at how important to defend Taiwan. But after Russia's aggression to Ukraine, the common people start to understand how important to defend Taiwan. So that's why the Japanese government has got the chance to increase their defense budget to support Taiwan. And in Taiwan side also, the effort is increased after Russia's aggression to Ukraine. So United States, yes, failed to withdraw from Europe. Before the Russia's aggression to Ukraine, the 40,000 US troops located in Europe, and this has decreased from the 100,000. But suddenly re-increased. United States need to re-increase their number from the 40,000 to the 100,000. So they need to return to Europe. That's true. But at the same time, the naval asset is still in the Indo-Pacific side. And Japan and Taiwan or other countries start to increase their defense budget because of the common people start to accept it. And Japan and South Korea start to cooperate. Japan and Philippines also start to cooperate. The Philippines start to accept military base, U.S. access to the military base in the Philippines as accepted by the Philippine government. So we are cooperate to defend Taiwan now. So in the long term, what will happen? It depends on how to improve our defense capability. Can we deter China's invasion, or China will succeed to change the military balance to invade Taiwan? So that depends on how much effort we can spend during Russia's aggression to Ukraine. That will be the decisive factor to deter China's invasion to Ukraine. That is my opinion, my analysis. Thank you.
Thank
you so
you,
much,
Dr.
sir.
Nagao. Let me also say the participants who wish to ask questions can use hand. There's a hand symbol on your screen. If you press it, then I will know that you wish to ask a question and I'll give you a chance. Since Argish has had questions for all the panelists, I'll again ask him to go ahead and ask his next question to next speaker.
Thank you so much, sir. So my question next was for Dr. Hans Jacob Schindler, sir. So I had quite a lot of questions for him. Sir, I'll try to club the first two questions. One is a small question. So my first question was a slightly theoretical. It was basically, how do we draw the line between nationalism and far-right thought? And my second question was, sir, that during the invasion, one of the reasons which was given was that Russia wanted to protect the Russian speakers. So can we consider this to be a formalization of the far right slogan in Russia, which emerged somewhere in the during the Tsarist era, which was Russia for Russians?
Thank you. So yeah, the dividing line between nationalist thought and right-wing extremist thought is really whether you are willing to have a liberal democracies which includes several opinions, which are also not including yours, whether you accept elections and their results, and not just a one-party system, and whether or not you use violence in order to further your aims. So you can have crazy ideas, but as long as you don't stay violent, I would not necessarily call this extremist. But if you are against individual freedoms, then that is definitely an extremist stance. As for the Russian side, this line is largely blurring now. You can call this a consolidation of society or steps towards autocratism, but the line is really hard to draw. As far as the protection of Russian speakers is concerned, you can see the amount of Russian speakers that support the Russian efforts in Ukraine at this particular point.
Yes, Argesh, your question to Alexander.
Yes, sir. Sir, I had a few more questions. I have just one more question for Dr. Hans, sir. So
Okay.
one of my question was, what is the nature of support and patronage given by Russian state or actors to the far-right camps across Europe, even perhaps the biker gangs, especially I have read somewhere about night wolves or something.
Yeah, so much has been talked about Russian support. It's far less organized and strategic because, as far as we can see, it is not geared to build up something like a fifth column. It's basically to sow chaos. So whoever is willing to, disrupt Western societies, put out false narratives, take part in influence campaigns, will get support from the Russian government. The aim is not here to build up something that would attack the West, but basically weaken the West through sowing internal dissent. So it's far less strategic, far less organized than it may look from the other side. But of course, this support is going on. As I said, the Russian imperial movement, which is fully under the control of the Russian state, was behind the letter bomb campaign of right-wing extremists in December and November in Spain. So there is, some organized support, but not in a sense that it will, in any way threaten strategically the West.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Argesh, you could ask
Yes,
your
sir.
question to Alex because I hope we continue to have connection with him.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir. Are you there? Yeah.
I think
So
we
my
have
question
lost.
was,
I think we have lost connection with him. I don't see him on my screen now.
It was
I
there
can
and
see
then
the
he just left.
Sir is on the screen, but he's
video of Alexander, sir.
Alex, can you hear us?
Yeah, already yes. I
Okay,
a question for me, but
we
now
can ask.
I lost everything. If it possible,
Yes, sir. I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
So my question for Dr. Alexander Ducek was, hello, sir. You had highlighted that the goal that you had mentioned, that the maximalist goal is the complete denazification of Ukraine. Sir, expanding on your point, if we see the end of World War II and the trials which happened and a denazification policy which was implemented, even after that, we have seen that there have been quite a lot of Nazi elements still remaining in Germany, which diluted over a long period of time. So my question was, how does the Russian government, in its maximalist aims, plan on doing the denazification once its aims for Ukraine have been completed?
I think anyway, the main idea of Russian government is a liquidation of Nazi regime. Really, please believe me. I live there. I know situation there. I can't be in Ukraine after 2014. Many of my friends was arrested. One was killed in Ukraine because just they had ideas to support cooperation with Russia, but not with the European Union. I was a lecturer, associated professor in university, but I never supported the European integration. I had no chance to be a professor in university, no chance. Now, when this conflict started a year ago, many of my friends, experts in economics, energetics, religion was arrested. Now, right now, many of my friends had a 15 years term in prison because one friend, he is a popular writer about Christianity. He support just Christianity, but they said no Russian church. It's not Russian, it's Ukrainian church. Okay, another one, expert in energy. He had 15 years term in prison because he just said about reasonable cooperation with Russia. It's enough. It's people afraid to talk with Russia by telephone because if you will be catched on street, you can killed because you have a number telephone in your telephone. And so the main idea, anyway, this regime must be killed because any other situation, if any Ukraine state called Ukraine, pro-Western government with the same ideas in the head will be exist, we will have more problem just after time, after 1 year, 2 years. It's impossible to talk with them because we remember these Minsk negotiations, Turkish negotiations, and peaceful talking. We can't believe them. They are liars. They said openly, we use time just for collecting weapons to fight with Russia. It's a problem of West because they don't want to see Russia with like a state from Baltic to ocean to Japan on this territory with 30% of natural resources under one state with population only 150 millions. They decide that they have possibilities to fight with Russia to the end because we know history. 17th century Polish tried to occupy Russia. Another century Sweden. Another century France. Another century German collective Europe. We lost 27 million people with the fighting with European Union of Hitler Nazi regime. Now they decided they can set what we must to do. We are sovereign state, not German sovereign state. France lost sovereignty. That's all. India, China, Brazil, maybe. A few countries on the world can decide what they want to do, how to develop our own economy. So we have a problem, really. And this conflict for a year, perhaps, because we are not killing peaceful people. Many of my friends live there. I don't want to talk about it because I know that our conference can be here, can be look people from Ukraine, and I'm afraid to talk about people who are living there now. So it's one. If the regime will be changed, maybe we can talk about, but not with peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence with Nazi impossible. Just only capitulation. If we are ready to fight, I will go to fight. I can say many of my friends went to like volunteers to the fight, and we are not happy to kill Ukrainian people. We are not happy because we understand that if people living, we can talk. It's possible to change conscience, but if somebody will be killed, it's impossible to talk.
Thank you, Alex. I see that we have questions also from Yash and Amandeep, but I want to invite my young friend Hiroaki from Japan. I don't know if he's in Kyoto or he's in Tokyo right now. Hiroaki, if you can hear, are you hearing me? If you are, then switch on your video. I want you to ask your question to Alex by yourself instead of me having to read your question. Hiroaki, are you there? Okay,
Hello.
yes, good to see you. Yes, you can
Thank
ask your
you.
question now to Alex yourself.
I'm from Tokyo. Actually, Chiba. Sorry. Next to Tokyo. My question is addressed to Alex. That's a very simple one. So everyone wondering about this, like earlier ceasefire of war in Ukraine is possible. When is it possible? Then what kind of conditions should be fulfilled to achieve this goal? So especially, what is Russia's plan for achieving this goal at this moment? So this is not only my concern, but everyone's concern, I believe. So then Russia is actually, as Alex actually something mentioned about this Nazi matter, but I'm still wondering something like Russia's position on this process, especially Minsk process, because Russia actually abandoned the Minsk agreement, original one. So that is why what is Russia's position at this moment is still Russia abiding by this kind of spirit of the Minsk agreement or not. So also I'm also proposing the holding the peace conference for all Ukrainian people in the Minsk. I believe this proposal is very much in line with this Minsk 2014 one agreement. So we can, facilitate making the Ukraine as a very democratic and inclusive countries together with Russia, if Russia actually believe this process is useful. Like if you see this Cold War history, actually Russia also supported German reunification. So I'm wondering this kind of narrative can be utilized, a lesson also utilized in this context, especially war in Ukraine. So also
Okay.
I heard today. Just one moment, just one last point. Actually, I heard that Russia actually the purpose of the Russia's special operation in Ukraine is actually supporting the Russian-speaking Ukrainian in the east. But some Russian-speaking Ukrainians are upset to Russia's military special operation because their asset are also indiscriminately destroyed by the Russia's special military operation. This I don't know if this is correct or not, but they also they actually their anger is increasing. Also, they are actually originally supporter of Russia's military operation. But so how Russia is addressing this concern? This is my question. Thank you.
Okay, let's now hear Alex.
I very shortly, I'll try. The Minsk agreements, it was the perfect idea for Ukraine. They're stupid, they refused it. Because Ukraine could be unit state. And please remember that the COP in 2014, it was the start of many events. It was a final step in occupation Ukraine from the West. It was killed many people on the square in Kiev and other states. It just was an illegal change of power. And the people on Donetsk and Lugansk and people in Donbass tried to keep the law. They supported Ukraine under the law, but the West organized the COP in Ukraine. And after it was a rebel to fight for previous law, previous government. And 8 years, during 8 years, it was the war. And Minsk agreement, it was a big luck for Ukraine. Because, yeah, of course, it could be a federalization of Ukraine. No, many countries, German, United States, Russia, Mexico, Brazil, have the same states, federal states. Why not? Yes, of course, with rights, local rights for local power. Why not? But they it's prohibited to use Russian language. I didn't go to football match because they crowd Nazi sentences. I didn't want to hear it. I can't find cinema films on Russian language. Why? The Kyiv is Russian-speaking city, so it was a big pressure on the people who live there. And you say about upset to Russia's military special operation in the East. Who upset? Who? What are you talking about? About whom? I don't know. I can say another thing. The Ukrainian power tried to press people who live now in Artyomovsk, in Bakhmut. They pushed to move people from the battle area to Ukraine. They didn't want to go to Ukraine. They left us. Let us alone here. They don't want to move to Kyiv. And now we please, you can see the Mariupol after awful fights. But now Mariupol has a perfect restoring. Many new buildings already built very quickly, and people going to Mariupol, people going to own cities under control of Russia. 3 million people went from Ukraine to Russia. I know this history and many people could go to Russia, but it was killed in their car when they moved to the border with Russia or Belarus. So no, it's really awful regime. I can say I can go to there because it was only I'll try to go border. I will be arrested.
Thank you, Alex. I know we have questions from Yash and Amandeep, but I don't see them on my screen right now. I see Shandilya. Shandilya Basu is on my screen and he's raised his hand, so I'll ask him to raise his question. Please, Shandilya, go ahead. We can't hear you. Maybe you're mute. Hello, we still, at least I cannot hear you.
So we seem to have issues from his end. So Biden, can we take question from Yash? I think he had written a question. He had written a few questions.
Is Yash here? Yash,
yes, sir.
please
He's
switch on
present.
your video. Can I see you on my screen, Yash?
Sir,
yes, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, everyone. My question is for Dr. Hans Jacob Schindler. So, Doctor, first of all, thank you for your talk. And I have a question which you might have heard and answered ad nauseum. With the unlimited unaccounted for weaponry that is flowing into Ukraine from NATO countries, how do you think will European Union countries balance their commitment to aid Ukraine's war efforts with the respective domestic security imperatives to ensure that these weapons do not find their way into the mainland in the hands of right-wing extremists? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very valid question because every conflict had that problem. So we're still collecting Russian weapons from the Balkan Wars in Europe among criminals and extremists. So this is a valid concern. European Union has already established a monitoring office in Moldova to ensure that at least we understand if there are any larger scale outflows from the conflict anywhere else. But unavoidably in a conflict, weapons become more than weapons. They become also currency. I always say there were few things that the Israelis were able to stop when they besieged Beirut in the 80s, but not the out and inflow of weapons and cigarettes. That was on both sides. The trade continued unabated. So there will be outflows, and that is a problem. As I said, at the moment, the only thing that can be done is to keep very diligent stock of what you send, including, of course, the chassis numbers of weapons, as well as the amount of ammunition who it was given to in Ukraine, in order to then at least have a complete inventory of the weaponry that has gone to Ukraine. And in case you find something, to be able to trace this back to whatever unit or management body was responsible for the weapons in Ukraine to stop any potential outflows in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Schindler. Shiladitya, can you hear me now? You're mute as of now, Shiladitya. Yes. We can't hear you even now. Are you saying something? I think if you remove your the cable and speak directly to your phone, that might be useful. Just remove that cable. Sorry, I think I'll now suggest to you that you write your question in the text box and we will read it for you because we are not able to hear you. We made 2 attempts. Amandeep, are you with us? You had a question for Dr. Nagao.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm here only. Good evening.
Yes.
Yes, Amandeep, please go ahead. Let me first check if Dr. Nagao is with us. Dr. Nagao, are you
Yes,
able to
sir.
listen to me? Are you with us?
Yes,
Because
sir.
we have a
You can.
question for you.
Yes, I can hear.
Okay, go ahead. Please ask your question, Amandeep.
Good evening, Nagav sir. So, can
Good
you
evening.
share your views on the South China Sea being the future battlefield and hampering the progress that Indo-Pacific has made till now, specifically regarding the role of Quad? Because we have seen most of the countries, the Indo-Pacific has been the go-to term, and everyone is interested in that. But I believe we are somewhere ignoring the South China Sea, and it may turn up a battlefield, like a surprising battlefield.
Okay, this is also the good question. Originally, the South China Sea is a very important area. All of the Quad summit mentioned about the ASEAN centric because of the location, the center of the Indo-Pacific. When we check the map, we can identify South China Sea as the center of it. But indeed, when we talk about how to deal with China, indeed, the South China Sea is also a very important part. Because view from China, where is the most vital part to defend? The rising developing the coastal cities a vital part of the China's defense. That's why China want to develop the fortress in front of these cities. That's why East China Sea, Taiwan, and South China Sea will be these areas. China want to establish one kind of the fortress. So in case of the South China Sea, what kind of plan? In Japan's perception, there's a possibility they will set up the artificial island. Why? Because the artificial island will be the one kind of the forward base to deploy the fighter jet, the patrol plane, the strategic bomber to exclude any fogging naval ship or fogging naval patrol plane. So in this case, China create one kind of sacred area by using the chain of the artificial islands. And after that, China will deploy the nuclear ballistic submarine because no the fogging naval ship or patrol plane can enter the South China Sea. In this case, they can deploy the nuclear ballistic missile submarine, which can attack the United States from the South China Sea. That's why this South China Sea is a very important vital part for the China's strategy to defend coastal line of China. So we compare the two situations. During the US-Soviet Cold War, the Sea of Okhotsk is a vital area for the Russia's nuclear ballistic missile submarine. And this Sea of Okhotsk is surrounded by the peninsula or islands, and the Russian Soviet troops can deploy the fighter jet or submarine to protect this Sea of Okhotsk. In this case, this submarine, this Sea of Okhotsk is very sacred area, and anytime they can attack the United States without detected by the US submarine. So this is a vital part of the nuclear deterrence. So China want to create same situation in the South China Sea. That's why they create artificial island, deploy the fighter jet, and exclude fogging naval ship. That is the process we believe. So that's why how to deal with it. The Japan side, the US side, or the like-minded countries patrol in the South China Sea, and China cannot hide the nuclear ballistic missile submarine is the solution. So Japan send the ship, US send the ship, or Australia send the ship, or Canada send the ship, European countries send the ship. That has happened before Russia's aggression to Ukraine. The problem is Russia's aggression on Ukraine shares the military resources of the US allies. So now the European allies, UK ship, the France ship, cannot come to the South China Sea. So Japan, US, or other coastal allies they need to deal with this situation. So under such kind of situations, we worry about China's move. Recently, after the Philippines accept the U.S. Request to access the Philippine base base in the Philippines, the Chinese Coast Guard ships pointed laser to the Philippine Coast Guard. Why? Because China can do that. Because the space China can do that. The naval presence we try to increase, but United States need to share more resources in Europe. So that's why the other country need to fill vacuum. Without this, China will be aggressive in this region, South China Sea. So that's why we must deter China's activity in the South China Sea. Without this, U.S. will face a two-front war and will face a serious situation. That's why Japan's role will be very big in this region, and Taiwan, with the Philippines, or South Korea, or of course, or India, of course, or Australia. We try to maintain military balance currently. Sorry, my explanation is too long. So thank you very much for asking.
Thank you so much. Sir.
Thank you, Dr. Nagao. Stay with us. I'm going to read one more question from Shiladitya to you. We were not able to hear him, so I'm going to read that question to you. Shiladitya is asking you, what is the response of Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN countries, and that by now have also developed strong relations with China, and China, of course, is backing Russia in this case. So how do you see that link of China's strong economic linkages with Southeast Asian countries influencing their response to the war? And are they playing therefore cautious when it comes to taking sides? Nagao?
This is yes. This is also a very important question recently because last 1 year, the Southeast Asian leader restart to engage with China because of course they worry about China's territorial expansionism in this region. But at the same time, because United States focusing on Europe just now, they expect that they want to create something, the cordial relation with China economically, especially. So, of course, for example, one of the examples is the Philippines attitude. New president of the Philippines, Bongbong Marcos, visit China first. After that, agreed with the United States. This is a clever way because before he visit, Bongbong Marcos visits China, if Bongbong Marcos agreed with the United States defense agreement, maybe China will refuse his visit. That's a clever way. But at the same time, why the first country he visited China? Because economically they want to continue the relation. Worry of the Southeast Asian country is will of the United States. If this country faces China's threat and needs U.S. Support, will U.S. support this country enough? That is maybe their concern. So currently, United States shares much military resource in Europe. They know that. That's why currently they do not want to create a situation they need to face China. So that's why they try to cooperate both sides at the same time. In the long run, maybe their stance will change, but in the short term, temporarily, they need to maintain the current situation without strong support from the United States. That is the kind of Southeast Asia is facing. So Southeast Asia also engage with cooperate with Japan or other countries. Why? Because they worry of the will or the resources the U.S. share for them. That is my analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nagao. Now, is there any other question from any participant to any of the panelists at this stage? Otherwise, I see Yash has raised his hand again. Yash, please, I'm not able to see you on my screen.
Sir, am I
Okay,
visible?
yes, I can see you
Yeah,
now. Yes, please go ahead.
thank you once again. Yeah, thank you once again for the opportunity. And my question is for Sir Alexander the Czech. Is he? Yes. First of all,
Yes,
sir,
he's
thank you very
there.
much for your talk. And I'll pivot away your topic away from Ukraine to Central Asia, and speaking in context of the unlimited partnership between Russia and China. How do you think Moscow perceives Beijing's growing status in Central Asia, given its Belt and Road Initiative project dwarfs, if I can use the word, dwarfs Russia's Eurasian Economic Union in terms of both political and economic scope? Thank you.
About the economic union, I think it's early to say, but anyway, the relations between Russia and China have a good perspectives, and we have enemy, and for Russia and for China, and I think China understand that it's impossible to have with the United States equal relations. United States tried always to use partners, not offer equal relations and to get benefits together. And now we have a good chance to make maybe not union, but support one another. And anyway, we afraid something. For example, now we are trying to create own industries and electronics and cars and other, but we are trying to remove Western industries from Russia to create own. But the process we have a lot of time, and China ready to help us, but we can change Western products on China products, and you know it will no for the term maybe it's not bad, but anyway Russia needs own industries in many things, electronics and technology, other technology also, and so people don't like to talk about military union, but I don't know why. Xi Jinping said we can stay back to back one to other. Why not? They support us. You see, BRICS. Russia has unlimited resources, unlimited. China has a great market and technology. Russia also has technology, military. We have in BRICS, Brasilia, 200 million people, great resources. South Africa, India, the biggest country with population, it's great market. If we will join our resources and our dreams, we can do anything. Nobody can stay like enemy against us. But we are not enemy. We just offer, please, let make a cooperation on equal rights. Why not? I don't understand. So, no, with China, yeah, now China has a problem with the United States. They have a problem with Taiwan. We have a problem on Ukraine. So we have many points to developing our cooperation position in any field, in trading, in military, foreign affairs, and so on. And of course, we are happy that we have a partner like China, like India, like Brazil, like South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and many countries who want to join to BRICS, to countries of Shanghai initiative. We have perspective. We are not sad about the situation. It must be done because 30 years West tried to create from Russia a slave. They want to see many different states on territory of Russia, many, 20, 50 different states. But we want to be a joint great empire. I want empire. Why not? No nations will not feel themselves best. Why not? In Russia, I feel myself like home. Now I can't go to Ukraine. It's changed. It's awfully changed the country. History crushed. Mentality, language, religion. Just only streets somewhere, buildings maybe, but the smell of there changed. I'm very. It's a pity to understand how the people feel themselves on Ukraine, because not everybody can change their place to live. It's really difficult. It's really difficult, and they try to find possibilities to live there. It's not easy.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
don't know. Maybe I'm not answering the question, but
No, you have answered. You've given us a very interesting perspective on this issue. I can see that Dr. Datesh Parulekar is still with us. Datesh, are you with us right now? Indeed, I had a question to ask you if you are with us still.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good to see that Datesh is still with us. I heard you making very interesting presentation on looking at variables like access, influence, leverages, determining sort of responses of various stakeholders and combatants. I wanted you to add also compulsions. For instance, very clearly, it's not an easy option for President Putin to not achieve victory. Because any understanding of defeat could be end of that regime, as most people believe. Compulsion for United States, Biden administration to undo the damage done during Trump presidency and make sure allies are kind of brought back into the fold and NATO cohesion is reinstated in that sense. Compulsions for India, in that sense, not being able to distance despite increasing discomfort with the continuation of war, not being able to distance from Russia, because that would put Russia, further closer to China, which is counterproductive for India. So basically, how would you also use the metrics of compulsions determining the kind of responses we have seen from stakeholders and combatant nations?
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
Datesh.
Thank you, Professor Swaran Singh. I think that's a very interesting aspect that you brought out. Definitely, I mean, when you look at the compulsions, for example, one could go back and say that Putin's compulsions were effectively set out in the early 2000s, when he effectively, in the wake of what happened with regime change opportunities, he spoke at Munich and he said, "Look, all kind of red lines with the Americans are over." And he also talked of cultural nationalism. So he says, wherever the Russians are, that is extension of Russian state. So my argument is that when you look at compulsions, sometimes compulsions are for course correction, but sometimes compulsions can also lead to miscalculations. So in this regard, quite clearly, Putin's compulsions are partly his own doing, and this could be a case of his miscalculation. So now walking back from it is becoming a difficult position. The American compulsions are very interesting that you brought out, because I would go back to the time of Obama. And we all know that in the wake of what happened in Libya and subsequently when he established the red lines with Bashar al-Assad, that testy meeting that happened in St. Petersburg G20, where Putin made it very clear that if there are red lines, then you will have to face me first and Bashar later. And the very fact that the Americans were seen as reneging back on its red lines was also a kind of a suggestion that America was a power in decline. So in many ways, when you brought out the compulsions of Biden, I think it's to also prove that the Americans are very much here. We're not a declining power. We're a power that can take on the responsibilities and the Trojan horse of big power conflict. But I would say the compulsion argument becomes all the more difficult to answer in a very straightforward manner, because we are right now in a very complex stage of multilateralism. And as I brought out the traditional multilateralism versus the new multilateralism, and the whole argument of how do you essentially shape your responses across different groupings, across different collectives. So on the one hand, India has to remain engaged with Russia, because obviously it wants not the Russians to get closer to China, but also it has a BRICS framework that it wants to be very relevant in and doesn't want to be isolated. At the same time, it sees the West as a major factor for its strategic capacitation. And right now, given the manner in which it's being coveted, I mean, the standing invite to the G7, a very prominent player within Western frameworks. So there are partly compulsions driven by miscalculations. There are compulsions driven by course corrections, as in the American case. And there are also compulsions of a middle power. So in the case of India, these are the compulsions that come with the stratification of India as a power. So India is a middle power that's looking to become a major power and has its own compulsions. So that's a very interesting aspect that you brought out, and that certainly is something that makes for a very kind of a composite understanding of the proposition.
Thank you, Datesh. I think we have quite crossed the time that was given for question answers, and we have taken some of the time that was given by hosts to me to make some concluding remarks from my side. I'll be short in saying few things as to how I look at ground realities and what I see as learning for all of us as academics. I think first thing that is noticeable very clearly here is how most of, in fact, several of the assumptions we have made in international relations as to how sort of interstate relationships are built and conducted stand questioned because of this continuation of Ukraine war beyond 1 year. First of all, I'm not aware of any major expert who had, first of all, anticipated that the power projection that was going on for about 8 months plus would actually end up with an actual hot war. Most people were estimating this is only going to be, sort of muscle flexing and it may not result in an actual war. It did, and it has continued. So in that sense, that assessment was really misplaced, that Russia will not actually go in and fight that war and continue to fight that war for more than a year, which also means the second component of the same question is assumption that many people made, that given the estimates about the strength of Ukraine armed forces, it was not expected to stand up for so long. In fact, Russian estimates, if I'm correct, and Alex can correct me, were to look at 2 weeks' time. And I think President Viktor was already sent to Belarus to walk into Kyiv, and regime change was being planned. Security guarantees were being sought from NATO and United States in written format. And so that kind of assessment of this war being a short, quick war also were a misplaced assumption. That's my second point. Third very important element of international relations was understanding that we are no longer in an era where state boundaries could be forcibly changed by any of the states, and therefore there was no possibility of taking over another neighboring state. And we had seen in 91 the Kuwait war in first Persian Gulf War, setting that kind of understanding that nations can't really take on territories of other nations, and that is something which was over a period of time witnessed changing in Moldova, in Georgia, in Crimea, and now of course in eastern Ukraine. And more interesting, because here we are talking of a major power or a nuclear superpower, which takes me to the next lesson, which again is very interesting, because it is for the first time, I think almost since Cuban Missile Crisis, that we have a nuclear superpower actually brandishing nuclear threat. going as far as saying that I am not bluffing. But apparently it is not showing that impact on NATO, because NATO apparently is not just continuing in its both covert and open support in terms of moral and material supplies and support, but also in that sense of, actually escalating. Now, I sit in Vancouver, where Canada is going to supply main battle tanks to Ukraine and maybe other countries, and there's also talk of even fighter jets. So in face of a clear expression of nuclear threat, uh, not only the war is not ending, it is actually witnessing an escalation, of course, within the conventional frame of war fighting. So many things that we assumed, were kind of the basis to how we analyzed international relations stand really questioned with the Ukraine war. Another, in fact, final point, a couple of points very quickly. The very institution of war stands completely transformed again. We had seen it transforming over a period of time. And war is, as we all know, is the ultimate tool that a sovereign state has to assert its sovereignty. And destruction is not desirable, but it is still legitimate tool for the sovereign state to use it. And that fundamental tool, ultimate tool of war as an institution, is transforming very rapidly. In first Persian Gulf War, I recall at the peak of the deployment, there was 180,000 personnel deployed by what was called private security companies. Now, private security companies obviously are not fighting for the national flag or for the national honor or for patriotism. They're fighting for, checks to be, sort of obtained from sovereign states who are who are wanting to hire them. And in that sense, the core of war being an activity authorized, authenticated, organized by state and conducted by standing armed forces, uniformed armed forces, began to transform. And Ukraine war, as Dr. Schindler very beautifully brought out, is creating a new genre of volunteers from both sides. Both sides have allowed volunteers, in fact, incentivized volunteers to be given citizenship by these two contending parties in case volunteers come and fight for their cause. And these are volunteers which neither need any authorization, not even authentication as to who they are. I mean, they could just be stateless people. They could be sharpshooters, they could be veterans, they could be, I'm just intentionally using these words. And therefore, that again changes the nature of war completely. And of course, the kind of continuation of this destruction gradually getting marginalized. I think that's my almost virtually last point I'm making. How Ukraine war, as it enters the second year, has shifted the narrative much more to the global geopolitics of major powers, that being the focus of narratives and debates, rather than the miseries and decimation happening on the ground where the war is taking place. And of course, war is not taking place in Russia. War is completely taking place within Ukrainian territory. So that shift of what is the global focus when we are talking of Ukraine war is again shifting very clearly in that sense. And that makes it very unpredictable as to where it is going to end, how it is going to end. Most wars since Second World War, if you have a broad look at history of last 90 plus years, have largely ended in stalemate out of sheer fatigue. And I think, is that going to be the fate of this war as well? And in that case, will Moldova, Georgia, Crimea be a model or a clue as to how this war is going to end as well? And if that war comes to an end, what happens to the whole reconstruction of Ukraine? And how do we think of people who have left Ukraine, families that have been separated? I am in Vancouver and I see several people here in Canada who have come from Ukraine. The whole dislocation that Alex brought about, Russians who have moved out of Ukraine to Russia or to other places, this whole dislocation, refugee problem and others. So lingering impacts of that conflict, not anticipating a clear end of that war in terms of a ceasefire and termination, but gradually dissipating and painful sort of lingering impacts of the war over a period of time. And I think there are several similar lessons that one could perhaps then look at, and how the whole equations between China, Russia changing, how China is becoming kind of an important player. I remember Dr. Nagao brought out that point in terms of who are likely winners from this war. And I dare say one of the clear winners of this war has been and will be the military industrial complex of advanced industrialized countries. And in that sense, to what extent is the military industrial complex influencing how wars are fought and conducted whenever they are, whether they are in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, or now in Ukraine. So fundamentally, I think this war has a lot to offer to academics or researchers or experts studying security studies, studying war, studying international relations. And in that sense, will be inflection point in many of these considerations. And give me just last 5 to 10 seconds to also say inflection point for India's foreign policy. Being able to sort of muddle through or stay on course with this assertive, proactive neutrality position of sort of balancing between two sides, which is a very difficult act to perform, especially if the crisis continues. As long as this has continued, the impact that it is showing on India's G20 presidency, and how hopefully we are looking to some kind of possibility of a final document being sort of clubbed together during the summit meeting. So many of the questions that are thrown up to all of us by this Ukraine war, rather than answers. I think answers are not easy to come by. And that is why I think discussions like these will have to continue. And I look forward to listening to all of you and many other experts on the subject again and again, and interact with you, and look forward that we might begin to get some answers that will give us some predictability as to how international relations are going to move in coming times, because uncertainty is definitely uncomfortable. And uncertainties of Ukraine war has created, as we are now saying, shortages and price hikes in food, fuel, fertilizers, and finance capital around the world. That is another kind of disruption that is visible in India's neighborhood, in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. So these are large amount of sectors which are getting impacted, both tangible and intangible linkages that the Ukraine war has with life around the world. And I just hope that we begin to not just be aware of interesting questions, but also gradually able to explore and work together in finding some of the answers to these questions. With that, I think I should stop. We have crossed our given time by about 8 or 9 minutes. And with that, thank you everyone. And I want to also record my appreciation of all the panelists. I'm not sure how we can show our sort of pleasure and respect for all their comments. I can only gesture as if I'm clapping, because if we were meeting face to face, applaud would be sort of showcased by standing ovation to such nice speakers. Thank you very much to each of the speakers, Dr. Nagao, Dr. Parulekar, Dr. Schindler, Dr. Alexander Duchek, and of course to my very dear friend Nalapat Madhavan Nalapat. I can see Amandeep has found a way of showing the appreciation by clapping on screen. Thank you, Amandeep, for doing that. And with that, I hand it back to Akolkar, Argish Akolkar.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for those kind words. Thank you, respected Professor Swaran Singh, for being the session chair for this session. And further on, I would like to thank all the respected panelists who provided their detailed input and their valuable time. With this, I would also like to thank the audience. And with this, we come to the conclusion of the session. Thank you so much, everybody.